The title of our panel discussion today is Each Generation Must, Out of Relative Obscurity, Discover its Mission, Fulfill it or Betray it. And Frantz Fanon's words that frame our panel today are now more meaningful than ever. Young people, we know, have often been at the forefront of pushing for radical changes in our society. Whether it be Steve Biko and his generation, the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall generation, Me Too, or those reminding us that Black Lives Matter. In this panel, we pick up on the concerns that face young people in this current post-COVID-19 moment, where we see continuing struggles around youth participation and voice, around quality education, unemployment, a lack of sustainable livelihoods, continuing gendered inequities and violence, all amplified, we know, and deepened by COVID-19 ruptures. Despite the challenges of household poverty, unemployment, crime, violence, substance abuse, and the difficulties in obtaining an education, we know that young people are optimistic, that they have a strong sense of agency, are aware of their own role in changing their lives, are willing to face challenges, are creative, and use their agency and passion to fashion new futures. In the 17th annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture, Angela Davis argued that young people now are standing on the shoulders of older generations and are able to see more than we were ever able to see. Through their activisms, they are addressing some of the foreclosures, erasures, and questions that older generations were unable to address. She also reminded us that through their activisms, young people have not only been addressing these incalcitrant questions, but also modeling new forms of leadership, feminist leadership, black feminist leadership, queer leadership, trans leadership, leadership that is collective and democratic, and that allows us to articulate new vocabularies of resistance, highlighting the feminist dimensions of our struggles as interconnected, interdependent, and intersectional. We know that young people are often framed through a paradigm of risk, of passivity, of danger, with little integration of the multiple layers of their identities and how these intersect to produce their complex and multi-layered experiences. These intersections produce experiences of marginalization, disempowerment, and discrimination, but also produce senses of belonging, participation, resistance, community, and of freedom. They offer us a space to imagine alternative futures and to practice radical decolonial hope. As Jill Bradbury has stated, working with youth is an act of imagination, creating new storylines oriented towards a future that we hope will be more just and more equal than our current shared worlds and our own histories. So in our conversation today, we ask, what kind of commitments do we need to make today to create solidarities with future generations and future leaders of psychology? What does solidarity with younger and future generations look like? And I ask this as an old person. I've asked each of the panelists to address these questions from their own positionalities and from the perspective, perhaps, of some of the work that they have been engaged in. So I will introduce all of the panelists, and then they'll go up and speak one after the other, after which we'll have some time for engagement with the audience. Up first, we have Haile Matutu, who is a queer doctoral candidate at the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa at the University of Cape Town. His work on intimate partner violence among queer men aims at developing non-oppressive practices of doing psychological research with marginalized populations in South Africa. His interests are largely in decolonizing feminist methodologies, the construction of identities and subjectivities, particularly how sex, race, culture, and place intersect with and influence psychological phenomena among people on the African continent. He aims to develop a body of work centered on African ethics in the field of psychological research with marginalized populations in the global south. He aspires to be a feminist. Bridget Mogoje is a student registered counselor completing a practicum at the Department of Correctional Services, Kroonstad, and Fezile Dabi District Department of Education. Bridget is the current SISA Student Division Chairperson and is an established social activist with extensive work with Soul City as a social mobilizer. She has leadership experiences in various organizations such as the Golden Key UFS chapter and TEDx UFS, and as we saw earlier on, Bridget also received an Emerging Leader Award, SISA Award. Tumi Jonas Mpofu was born and bred in Ekapa, grappling from an early age with issues of social justice. Motivated to understand and challenge herself and those around her, she has, over the past 15 years, been involved in social justice work across the continent. She's involved in various spaces where she labors in thought and practice on building just, caring futures for the oppressed. Nomagugu Ngwenya is an emerging scholar at UNISA's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. Having completed a master's degree at WITS, her interest is primarily set in critical social psychology. Through the exploration of race relations, gender dynamics, her work often aims to advocate for the inclusion of intersectional identities that are predominantly marginalized or overlooked. Within the Institute, she's currently working on projects that are aimed at understanding healing and violence within community contexts, as well as leading on a campaign aimed at fostering social cohesion within surrounding communities of the Institute. So welcome to all of the panel. Please join me in giving the panelists a warm welcome. I've asked each of them to speak for roughly 12 minutes, as I said, after which we'll engage in conversation and discussion. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Maze nisibulisele emakhaya nixele ukuba singonantsi abafakudala. Ze nixele ukuba umzi uza kuvuka wonke ekufeni. Neenkomo mazixhelwe zonke ezi zikhoyo kuba zifuywe ngezandla ezingcolileyo. Kuba kukho nabantu abaphethe ubuthi. Makungalinywa, makumbiwe izisele ezikhulu ezitsha, kwakhiwe nezindlu ezikwantsha, kubiwe neengqili ezinkulu zeenklathi, kusikwe intsuba, kulukwe neengcango zokuba zibe zininzi. Zitsho inkosi uNaphakade into kaSifuba Sibanzi. Abantu mabalulahle ngokwabo ubuthi, bungade bumbululwe ngamagqirha. This is an excerpt from The Land is Ours by Thembeka Ngcukaitobi. When I was asked to share my thoughts on, firstly, what kind of commitments do we need to make to create solidarities with future generations and future leaders in psychology, and secondly, what does solidarity with younger and future generations look like, I wondered how far I could go. Whom would I include? Whom would I exclude? Who would matter in my reflection? Why would they matter for this Congress? The chilling instruction read earlier was given to Nongqawuse, then 15 years old, by two strange men who appeared to her one morning in April 1856. The niece of local medicine man Mhlagaza went to chase birds, as she was wont to do, from cornfields along a river known to the locals as Klach. According to the legend, the men identified themselves by names known to Nongqawuse, though the men themselves were long dead. For those who speak in other tongues, the excerpt from Tembeka Ngcukaitobi's book that I read roughly says, everyone must kill all their cattle. They must not plow. They must destroy the food in their possession. All forms of witchcraft must be abandoned. Once this was done, preparations for a new world should begin. New kraals must be built. New houses must be built. The understanding being that if these instructions were carried out, within 8 days the dead would arise and the whites would return to the sea. For me, the passage illustrates the histories that are conveniently forgotten. I want to suggest that before we can think of any solidarities with future generations and future leaders in psychology, we need to deal with the past. No amount of positive psychology will heal the wounds we carry as the enraged natives that we are. And the others who have to exist alongside both those who question our very existence and those who choose to align with our vision of being in the world. They too must reckon with the past. In their book, published recently, Pan-Africanism and Psychology in Decolonial Times, Casey, Bunza, and Gallagher affirm the experiences of many students from this region in stating, we argue that a Pan-African psychology must necessarily be decolonial, feminist, and transdisciplinary. This has me thinking about the many generations of children of the soil who have given their ultimate sacrifice for the realization of this ideal of Pan-Africanism. We are, after all, not the first to put our futures, our lives, and mental health at risk for the ideals of freedoms otherwise not legible from where we are currently sitting. Echoing the call of memory work in Du Bois, Padmore, and Nkrumah, Nkovo reminds us that, and I quote, colonial domination in the sphere of knowledge production has not only played a role in emptying the minds of African subjects of their knowledges and memories, but it has also played a part in implanting foreign ways of knowing and remembering. So how shall we heal if we refuse to reckon with the layers of generational traumas that we in psychology often reduce to individual pathologies? How can we heal? How can we deal with our histories while effectively teaching students of psychology to help the most vulnerable? They have to adopt. They have to convince them to adapt to their suffering and call it resilience. A word that rings like poison to me. Those of us who, without thinking about the shitstorm that we're creating by rendering ourselves unemployable for saying such things, and for our refusal to speak about inclusivity, respectability, the correct ways of engaging systems that are violent, to the souls of those who are oppressed. The youth largely say, "Makunyiwe macala." I join that chorus today. If your idea of freedom does not include an engagement with the histories that still manifest in the present, I say, "Makunyiwe macala." I say this inspired by the repercussions of the denial or moral obtuseness that I've witnessed in South African higher education and the discipline of psychology, with reference to the recognition afforded to those who have tried to engage cis heterosexual white supremacy with the force and energy that it deserves. Some of these people are languishing at home, unable to find work because of having been marked as disruptors. And in some cases, they're deemed criminals. Yet, universities do not miss a beat when it comes to claiming gains that were made possible through the activism of those undesirables, who did not just pay lip service to what ought to have been done, but I've also noted that this is not just something that is isolated to students of the Rose Must Fall and Fees Must Fall collectives. We see it now. Students who are at universities, who are made to take on the difficult task of helping university do what is necessary to bring their often lofty visions into reality. Why do universities not have mental health budgets for those who actually make change happen in these entire universities? I speak here of students who choose to align with the struggles of the people who hold very little power in our universities, such as the people who clean our classrooms, the people who feed us in our residences, the people who drive us from our taxi rank to those lofty universities we belong to. In thinking about the space I occupy in the university under the Devil's Peak, I've been asking myself, what does the raising of our collective consciousness mean in the context of engaging with the idea of an intellectual home, with reference with those who were, and in some ways, were not considered to belong in the academy? What does it mean when the native, formerly the subject of research, comes into institutions of higher learning to conduct psychological research? Can such a space be a natural home, or ought it be cleansed of its affinity and allegiances to systems of oppression before it can even approximate what I and many others recognize as home? The thing about the benefit of hindsight is that it allows us, the people of the academy, to feel safe. We're able to pontificate all manner of social issues because we allow ourselves time to think, to look at things from a multitude of vantages. But it also removes us from the hard work and the human condition of making mistakes, a condition that's more difficult for social activists who seldom have the luxury of time when crises arrive. I wonder if this logic is not the only thing that is others outside of the academy looking at us with disdain. Even as I make this observation, I'm mindful that our analysis of social life will always benefit from this logic. After all, we are not the first responders. Yet, our pontification might obscure this because when we do speak, it is with the full might of whatever we profess or whatever was conferred upon us at the end of our training. We are the professionals. We believe we know what we're doing. So to answer the question, what does solidarity with young and future generations look like, I want to suggest that we might begin by seeing the links between the struggle of youth in different eras of our collective past. For those in the academy, it might be helpful to equip those with whom you train to the conscious realities of social life in this country. It would be helpful if you stop peddling indigenous psychologies of North America and European contexts as psychology writ large. You might even want to consider what you yourself know about this place that you so fondly call home. Connected to this, would those who have institutional power do something about what happens in our classrooms? Could you please stop naturalizing our suffering by telling us that we are impatient when we say we refuse to die before the necessary changes, not only in the academy, but within the discipline of psychology, have been realized? I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues on this stage who will bring our thinking about the very idea of solidarity and even whom we imagine when we speak of the youth. I find myself too angry to not just drop a series of F-bombs and say, fuck everything. Because I'm inherently hopeful. I'm also a romantic, but a romantic of freedom fight, child of freedom fighters. I see us constantly betraying the activism and politics of previous generations, of people who bring about change in terms of relations of power. Maybe we need to let go of the idea that we're somewhat better than our predecessors. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. So I'm going to frame my talk around significant moments in history that students have been a part of, and I'm going to use that context to really just answer the questions of what solidarities can we build and what commitments can we get into with the older generation as psychology's next generation. So to build solidarity with psychology's next generation, we need to understand the plight of the next generation, the victories they have had through various movements, and the failures that the system continues to burden this generation with. The brief for this session has called us to reflect on young change makers who were at the forefront of making changes and what those changes mean for us. I would like to look at the Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall movements, which have ensued in South Africa in 2015. And I was in university at the time, so I was at the forefront and I saw it firsthand. So there's been no student movement in the democratic South Africa that has been as big as the Fallist movement. This movement was built on the ideals of access and representation. Students identified a gap in the curriculum being taught versus the realities of our communities. Therefore, they found it necessary to call for decolonization and advocate for spaces in institutions of higher learning, which are representative of the current population of the country. We needed spaces in institutions of higher learning which represented who we were. The rise of these two movements brought into the spotlight various other thematic areas which have previously been continuously swept under the rug. Under these two Fallist movements, we saw various other hashtags arise, such as hashtag Open Stellenbosch and various other hashtags. These hashtags were mainly covering topics such as racism, sexism, patriarchy, which is hashtag patriarchy must fall, language, which we saw at the University of the Free State in Potchefstroom as well, and feminist theory. Students who would ordinarily not have access to these thematic areas in the classroom or in their communities began being sensitized to the oppression of marginalized people. These students were able to take these conversations into their communities where they would have ordinarily not been. The Fallist generation showcased to us that the struggle for access is not just access to institutions of higher learning, but representation as well. They made us realize the importance of seeing ourselves represented in the classrooms, in the curriculum that we're learning, and in the spaces that we are entering in. As a result, these movements succeeded in catapulting the age-old conversations of decolonization and ensuring access to students from poor and working class backgrounds. When the country was seeing record numbers of students enter the system through the gains of these Fallist movements and prospective students being turned back due to spaces being full, then we suddenly went into a pandemic and we had COVID-19. COVID-19 came at a time where more students had entered the system through battles fought by Fallists. By virtue of having students from all backgrounds being represented in institutions of higher learning, COVID truly highlighted the plight of South African communities. When COVID put the whole world at a standstill and gatherings were prohibited, lecturers, conferences, supervision meetings moved online. The shift from face-to-face interaction to online interactions brought to our attention the high numbers of students who do not have access to devices, data, stable internet connection, or students who simply live in environments that are not conducive for learning. And for most people, this was the first time they were coming face-to-face to the realities of these students. The COVID regulations enforcing citizens to be homebound succeeded in accentuating the gap between the different classes in South Africa. In a country that is declared to be a war zone due to its high rates of violence and gender-based violence, the spotlight truly shone on the communities that bear the brunt of these statistics. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic on the news how daily we saw women and children being killed, being kidnapped, and the high cases of domestic violence that were taking place. As a result, it began to be as clear as day how wide the inequality gap truly is in South Africa. And as students, as emerging practitioners, emerging academics, it is truly important for us to learn about these inequalities, these differences, so that we are able to cater to these communities, to go back and to be practitioners who are well versed with the struggles of our communities. Students mainly found that institutions of higher learning were their safe haven, and having to go back home, as I've illustrated, truly brought them face to face with the realities of their families and the communities that they lived in. Students found themselves studying under the most unconducive environments. And the impact on students in this time, we saw that the mental health of students began to decline, and university systems, the wellness centers, psychologists on campus, they were not there readily available for the students, and with the influx that was there, not all students were able to access these services. Therefore, my contribution to the commitments that we need to make and the solidarities that we need to make is that we need to position ourselves to be ready to cater to the gains of the fullest generation. As practitioners in the room, academics in the room, it is important for us, from a student perspective, to have this kind of solidarity that enables us to be aware of the communities that we are going to go into. Currently in our universities, we know that more universities, more master's programs are pushing to have an African-centered psychology. However, in some institutions, that's not always the case from first year level. Therefore, the first time students really interact with this is while they're doing their masters. And that's not necessarily sufficient time to truly understand the plight of most South African communities, to truly understand the struggles that South African communities live through on a daily basis. And while we know that not most students get to make it to these master's classes, most psychology students end up working in NGOs, they end up taking different lines of work, but however, they still manage to make it into working into communities, in communities, and being advocates for social justice. Therefore, it is imperative that our institutions of higher learning, that the curriculum that we offer is able to prepare these students for the communities that are out there, because as my colleague has already mentioned, that a westernized psychology is no longer going to do the job. A westernized psychology is no longer going to be able to prepare us to be fully functional practitioners who are able to cater to every single person who walks through our door. We know that in our country at the moment that mental health is largely inaccessible to these communities where we speak about, that are riddled with poverty, that are riddled with unemployment. Therefore, in order for us to make sure that mental health services are accessible to these communities, we need to have practitioners that are able to sensitize with these communities and are able to make sure that the services that we offer are able to be representative of the people who are waiting at the other end of them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dumi. A couple of days before coming here, I think I came back home on Saturday after a wonderful retreat that I had with colleagues. And later on that afternoon, I found myself getting really, really anxious, to the point where like physically I wasn't okay. And I thought that the anxiety is because of this very moment here. But I soon realized on Sunday nights, if not Monday morning, that it's because schools are opening. I'm a mother to a 7-year-old child. And this anxiety I was feeling was because schools are opening, and this child goes to a predominantly white school, and the things that I have to deal with on a daily basis right? Just to advocate for this little black boy. Getting notes every day telling you about his behavior, being summoned to meetings and sitting on a chair next to this 65-year-old white woman who's his teacher, and I'm transported right back to sitting in front of Mevrouw Bosman, who also made me a problem. And now I find myself in a situation where I'm having to deal with the child in me that was problematized at that stage, but I had nobody to advocate for me, but I have to advocate for this child. And the ways in which, I mean, you spoke of the inaccessibility to mental health services, and where you do have access to that, the ways in which that's used against you. I mean, I'm paying through my nose for all kinds of things because there's a problem with this child. And this problem really is because he's a little bit too free, right? This is behavior that nobody would even bat an eye for if he was a white boy, because it's normal behavior. But when it's a black boy who is a bit too free in a space, then we find problems with him. And we have to go to occupational therapists, you have to go to play therapists, you have to go to psychiatrists to do tests, you have to go to, because they will not rest until I put this child on medication. And when I talk to other black parents, it's the black kids that they want to medicate in the space. And you may ask yourselves why I'm telling you this, because, I mean, I'm sure many people here have kids and you all think your kids are wonderful, but why am I telling you about mine? I'm telling you about this because I think when we talk about young people and when we talk about youth, this little snippet of my life that I'm sharing with you is not what comes to mind, right? In the public imagination, popular imagination, when we talk about youth, we think of a group full of energy, right? With all the time in the world, disruptors, protest, all of these things, right? In all of these highlight moments of events that are really, really important in terms of the contributions of young people. But when we move away from those spaces, our everyday lives, what does that look like? And I'm just giving you a snippet of what that looks like. But we don't talk about those things, right? And we find ourselves as young people at times maybe overperforming this, you know, being disruptors and full of energy and what, while silencing these everyday struggles that we have. You know, Sisonke Simang spoke of a time in history where, you know, it was a time of just pain and so much anger. I think that's the time that we're finding ourselves in as young people right now. We are angry and we are in pain. We are hurting. But we don't talk about that very much, the ways in which we are hurting, right? Because we're very much characterized by the protest and all the other things that we're doing, which, again, very important. But that's just one story. I, again, had to think about, I mean, I'm very close to not being youth anymore. And then as I was thinking about my time and the work I've done and the spaces I've been in as a young person, and thinking about how when we talk about youth in relation to whatever, you know, there are these prefixes that are used when it comes to youth, right? Words like next, future, tomorrow, you know, the next generation of, the future leaders of, you know, the what of what. I'm nearly out the door and it's still future, it's still next, it's still tomorrow. When does it become today? When do we get a glimpse of what it looks like? It's almost elusive because it's always in the coming, you know? And there are ways in which, I mean, looking to the future is very important, but there are ways in which that also allows for some kind of patience with the way things are, right? And Floretta spoke about the ways in which young people have modeled what leadership can look like. But this modeling of these decolonial feminist leaderships, it's almost boxed and just kept in the youth structures, right? Because we have main structures and then we have youth wings, right? Like as if we have youth issues and societal issues. But youth issues are societal issues. But for some reason, we're finding youth participation, full participation, youth leadership, and all of these things just there in the youth wing. So I think we need to really re-examine and look at that relationship between main structures or older generation and youth and see if there aren't other models that we can follow outside of this main and youth wing. And not to say that we shouldn't have youth wings. And so to try and move closer to attempting to answer the question of what commitments do we need to make today, I think my two colleagues here have proposed some options. Maybe to add to that, I'm not sure about this responsibility that's put on a generation, for such a mammoth task that's put on a generation that has limited power in terms of resources, in terms of institutional power, etc. I'm not sure if that's where we want to go. And maybe more consciously looking at a intergenerational approach to it may help us. Because as I said before, we're really struggling as young people. We're really, really struggling. So, and as I say that, as I suggest an intergenerational approach, I say this also knowing that the relationship between young people and the older generation is one that is quite complicated in itself. I think there's a lot of wounding that has happened there, where young people now feel like they've been wounded in some ways by the very same people that we love very much. There are ways in which young people talk about older generations not being in touch with where things are in the current, with not moving out of the way, with being gatekeepers. And there are ways in which older generation also feel like these ones are disrespectful. They are not appreciative of what we did for them and where things are, so a little bit ungrateful. So I think there's something there to interrogate. I think there's a conversation that needs to happen there in just mending that relationship. And maybe from there, we can talk about what it is that we need by fostering the wisdom that lies within and between these generations. Because I'm not sure if we've done a really good job at that. I think I'll leave it there.
Afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank CISA for inviting me to speak at this panel and to acknowledge the other panelists who spoke before me. Just going straight into this discussion, I believe that the mission of this generation has made itself more apparent with the wave of movements the other panelists have spoken about, like Fees Must Fall and Black Lives Matter. Both these movements having seemingly been triggered by a particular set of events, and as we've witnessed, spreading sporadically throughout the nation in the case of Fees Must Fall and globally in the case of Black Lives Matter, speak to the current generation being active participants in shaping the future. Although there remains a need for more participation, collaboration, contributions to each respective agenda by us as people first, and then as professionals within psychology. As we have increasingly found ourselves in insecure times with issues of unemployment rising, education in many ways remaining inaccessible, people experiencing more difficulty in sustaining themselves, and continuously rising levels of crime and violence, I believe moments such as those referred to, which intend to address systematic injustices and inequalities that continue to affect the day-to-day lives of previously disadvantaged people who are in fact currently marginalized people in society, are critical not only because they challenge the very conventions of capitalism, government, education systems, cisgender norms, etc., but also because they challenge how we think about these events as psychologists. So in building solidarities with younger and future generations, I think looking at the backdrop of our current socio-political and economic climate and the responses to it evidenced in these movements, the future generations require us to immerse ourselves in these movements so we are truly connected and have a sense of relationality by the point in which we analyze these events as psychologists. Being in a profession which prioritizes more traditional thoughts and methods when attempting to address issues, example, using psychoanalysis and psychotherapeutic interventions, we unfortunately run the risk of pathologizing people without taking into account the structural nature of social suffering and individualizing social problems. Additionally, with the issue of voice being so pertinent, especially where social issues are concerned, it's important for psychologists to consider context-specific understandings of issues which affect individuals and groups in society, and center these particular understandings as the basis for our conclusions regarding these issues in order for us to build solidarity with the future generation. When one thinks about building solidarities, my sentiments are that one should be thinking about building solidarities as people who are equally affected by issues in society, prior to thinking about building them as psychologists. As it is proven in many cases, remaining objective within society has created many subjectivities is not an option. From my own personal experience as a young Black woman navigating the profession and my work and the world in general, I oftentimes find that I need to assert myself more than what perhaps some of my male colleagues may have to, or other colleagues may have to, when working within the context of the community. Because being a woman and being young and Black work against me when it comes to politics of respectability, although we may be able to relate on the basis of race. In other contexts where the gender dynamic is less applicable, I may be subjected to unfair treatment simply on the basis of race, whilst in others I may be more accepted because of my perceived class background or sexuality. Thus, when we consider intersectionality and the aspects of one identity which are used as basis to subject them to various subjecthoods, one can always find a community in which they are able to build solidarity with. Furthermore, once we locate these communities, we'll be able to truly advocate for what is just and use our personal experiences, which are always connected to larger social and political structures, as points for support for those exercising their agency. This would ultimately enable us to embrace alternative and radical forms of healing, such as acts of resistance, various forms of art, performance, etc., which all provide a platform for people to reclaim their subjecthood. This is particularly important because conventional psychotherapeutic interventions also remain inaccessible to many, as Dumi has said. Thinking of the personal as political is also beneficial as it enables us and more established psychologists to form alliances with emerging and future psychologists who would benefit from discussions like these most. To emphasize the above, I believe in order to create solidarity with future leaders in psychology, the current generation of psychologists should consider intersectionality and subjectivities to better support and equip future psychologists beyond redress policies which inform race, gender, and persons with disabilities quotas in their respective departments. From the subjectivities and one's own personal experience of navigating the profession within your own particular identity, psychologists should share strategies that they employed as people who have also fought a system, addressing these challenges with their mentees and supervisees. As a beneficiary of this, from my experience with my master's supervisor, Prof. Kigua, and my current supervisor at the ISHS, Prof. Safla, the sharing of resources is critical in creating a space in which one feels a sense of community and a sense of belonging within the field. As one moves beyond the university and into the professional space, one oftentimes feels intimidated when confronted with new challenges, which is why I believe having the presence and support of more experienced colleagues in the field accompany you in the early stages of embarking the more practical work is beneficial. At the undergraduate level, an open line of communication and transparency regarding future prospects within the profession is also essential, as oftentimes undergraduates are not fully knowing the requirements that it takes to practice within the profession. And to offer my concluding thoughts, I stick within the theme of Fanon and offer you the following quote. When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. So in closing, I refer to the Fanon quote to describe the state of our society and thus hope to provoke the community of psychologists who are present today to engage the ideas presented throughout by all the panelists and to continue thinking about building solidarities within the profession to strengthen the overall agenda of supporting a society which can no longer breathe. Thank you.